Welcome. It's so lovely you're all here. I'm imagining you all and sort of being really pleased that you're in the room with us. Thank you very much for joining us for the launch event for Queen Mary Conversations this evening. My name's Aoife Monks and I'm the Arts and Culture Lead for Queen Mary. And last year we commissioned 27 conversations between artists, arts workers and community organisations and Queen Mary academics. And the reason for that was that we felt that conversation just after lockdown was one of the most important things that we could do. So in order to launch and celebrate the conversations and the outcomes of those conversations, we thought it was only appropriate to gather some people together to think about what a conversation actually entails. What's going on when we converse? What is it that we think might matter about conversation or bring us benefit? Who are we talking to when we are talking to ourselves? I thought it was interesting to reference the Oxford English Dictionary's definition of conversation in its earliest iteration, because it kind of encapsulates so much. So according to them, a conversation is consorting or having dealings with others, living together, commerce, intercourse, society, intimacy. So I think that covers an awful lot of ground, and it struck us as particularly valuable to draw together academics from a whole range of disciplines, from the sciences, from history and from theatre, to think with us about what a conversation might entail. But we also really wanted to celebrate the artists who produce such beautiful work in response to their conversations with Queen Mary academics, and we've invited some of those to join us as well, and we're going to have a look at some of their work. Before we do, I just wanted to say a very quick thank you to the people who made this possible, which is all of you, all the people who got involved, and the people who nominated the artists and arts workers and community organisations too. This was an enormous effort. There are many people involved in this project, and I hope lots of you are here tonight, and I really want to say thank you. I'm sorry we're not in rooms together drinking warm white wine and eating slightly desultory sandwiches, but we hope that we can do that together very soon. So before we start our conversations, I just wanted to show a 5-minute film by the artist Lucy McCormack, who had a conversation with Jade French, who's a researcher in modernist literature, who looks particularly at aging in women and what she calls creative crones. So Lucy made a film in response to this conversation, which is about 5 minutes long, and it felt like a very apt way to begin the evening. So Louisa, who is running this Zoom for us, I should say I'm from Ireland, and we had a very famous chat show called The Late Late Show in Ireland. And Gay Byrne, when he wanted to show a clip, would say, "Roll it there, Roisin." And I've always wanted to say that in public. So there's no Roisin, but I'm going to say Louisa, roll it there, Louisa. Let's have a look at Lucy's film. Thank you.
I don't think there's any audio.
Oh, sorry, Louisa. I said roll it there, Roisin, and actually it looks like we're having problems watching it, which is a classic case of digital issues. Lots of people are saying they can't hear it. So I tell you what, Louisa, should we stop it and bring Pat on and maybe have you work away in the background to see if we could get that tech to work, because actually this is a perfect moment to introduce Pat Healy, whose work is on digital interaction, and we've probably just had a very good example of the ways that can go wrong. Pat is Professor of Human Interaction and Head of the Cognitive Science Research Group in our School of Electronic Engineering, and his research focuses on human-to-human interaction and how technologies can enable richer and more effective forms of communication, or sometimes not, Pat. So we were going to talk about Lucy's film, but we can talk about the fact that we couldn't even watch it. Can you talk to us a little bit about what we're doing right now on this screen between us? we're in theory having a conversation, but we're doing it online. What's the difference between what we're doing here and what we would be doing if we were in a room together with warm white wine? What's missing or different about the nature of our conversation?
Yeah, so you can hear me, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, that's a good start. There are a lot of differences. There are a lot of kind of, I mean, it's a shame Lucy's film didn't show because she illustrates some of them really well, but the most obvious one is turn taking. It's very difficult to time your turns on video conferences, and everyone's had this experience of meetings on Teams or Zoom where they just mistime it. They keep interrupting each other. And what that illustrates is an awful lot about the sort of cues we normally rely on. And the fact that they're not just about being able to see somebody. So, you know, I can see your face and you're kind of nodding to give me feedback at appropriate moments about what's going on. But that's not sufficient for us to be able to time those turn exchanges. And one of the things that is missing from this kind of window view of other people is you're not in a shared space. So it's strictly two-dimensional. I can't place gestures, you know, in space between us. And the significance of my body movements is different. Like you won't get much peripheral vision clues about head angle and so on. Now, when there's only two of us, that's okay mostly. But when there's more people, it really makes a huge difference. So, you know, if we were sitting around a table, we'd all be aware of who was looking at whom. But we've lost that in these kinds of situations. It's like that conversation around the table has been folded out and flattened and then stuck into, we're all stuck in a little hutch on each window.
And our hutches are all in different spatial configurations as well. So we're not all looking in the same directions and so on. You mentioned turn taking, which is really interesting. And why does that matter? And what does it say more broadly about why conversation matters? I mean, what are we actually doing when we converse?
I think, well, turn taking is kind of an example of something which is really well organized. So you know, on average, there's an offset between one person stopping speaking and the next person speaking of about 200 milliseconds. Now that's much faster than if I hold an object up and say, name this object, you'll take about 600 milliseconds. So from seeing something to being able to speak the name of it, it takes much longer than these, you know, me swapping over to you speaking in normal conversation. So that tells you something about it being very finely tuned. We're expecting what's coming next and when we're going to say it. And that's really important for lots of things we can do in conversation because the sequence of turns is crucial. If I want to ask a clarification question, it has to be clear what the context of that question is. It has to latch onto your prior turn in some way. The sort of broader thing about conversation though is it's such a fundamental human activity. So estimates vary a bit, but we spend about 1/3 of our waking hours in conversation. So that's more, you know, it's more than we do physical exercise. It's more, the only thing we do more is sleep, really. So it's really a really kind of fundamental feature of human interaction. And the other thing I always kind of, you know, I'm just kind of amazed by it, is it has really profound effects on mental and physical health. So, you know, even when you subtract all sorts of other factors like, you know, physical activity, pre-existing health conditions, social interaction on its own is a really strong predictor of health outcomes. And even some really odd ones like cardiovascular disease, cancer recovery, they're all really affected by level of social engagement.
Which suggests one of the reasons why perhaps people's mental health has suffered during the pandemic, because conversation has been curtailed or transformed in part through lockdowns. And that leads me to ask how you think a variety of technologies or histories of technologies have changed or shaped our conversational practices differently. So do telephone calls or these kinds of conversations and so on, how has technology actually reformed or reshaped how we interact?
Yeah, it's a very big question
It is.
that I can't really answer, but I think that the thing to think about with technologies of conversation is that even when we're face to face, we're using them, right? So our hands and if we start waving our glasses around, and we basically make use of whatever is available. If I'm going to give you directions somewhere, hands and voice are useless technologies for that. I start to need a pen and paper, and I start to need to draw the route for you, because that it's much more effective to do that. And so when we think about more exotic technologies like video conferencing, again, it's a resource that we then try to adapt to the purposes of interaction. And people are, we are doing different stuff with Zoom. People turn their camera off, and then when they want the next turn, the camera goes on first, and then oh right, they're probably going to speak in a little while. So we're quite rapidly evolving these changes in the way we use video conferencing. But still, it's very, I do think it's a very primitive and quite difficult form of interaction.
It's interesting, actually, to think that waving your glasses or writing notes might actually be a more sophisticated tool than video conferencing, because that's not how we're enculturated to think of it. But that's fascinating that we may have refined other tools better for how we use them in interaction than this one. That's really interesting. And I think that's probably a lovely moment to pause, Pat, because we're hauling you back at the end for a conversation. But for now, we're going to give it a go again and see if we can get the audio to work on Lucy. And I do think that is just such an appropriate thing to have happened when talking to you, Pat. We see all the ways the digital doesn't help us. Let's give it a go again. Louisa, should we see if it works? And if it doesn't, we'll give up. Let's give it a try. Thank you, Pat. Oh. Okay, still no audio. So we are living out exactly what Pat's talking about. Louisa, would you mind stopping that? I think we'll give up on that, sadly. What I will say, though, it's actually a very nice chance for me to plug our Queen Mary Conversations website, because Lucy's conversation with Jade has been curated online very beautifully, I think, and you can actually watch this film on her page. So I'm so sorry we couldn't watch it now, because it was wholly appropriate, because what we saw was her having a Skype conversation with two other versions of herself. That does lead me, however, beautifully into inviting Barbara to join me, so I can ask her some questions about what it means when we talk to ourselves. So Barbara is Professor of Humanities at Queen Mary University of London and is a founding scholar of the British Psychoanalytic Council. And she's currently leading on a Wellcome Trust funded research project called Pathologies of Solitude from the 18th to the 21st century. Barbara, let me ask you, when we talk to ourselves, who are we talking to? And I think you might be on mute appropriately. You're probably you're having an inner conversation.
There we are. Was actually, yeah. So, yes, but I don't mind being interrupted. Well, so both history and science show us many, many varieties of conversation in solitude, from just talking to ourselves, which is what's been described as the kind of inner chatter that accompanies all human consciousness, to dialogue with others, or with sort of alter selves, whose voices we hear within. I mean, if we ask the question, which I ask always throughout my research, which is, who are we with when we're alone? The answer nearly always is going to involve some kind of internal interlocutor, although it may not always be a conscious one. And for some people, of course, it involves auditory hallucinations, conversations with voices that appear to come from outside the hearer, which actually is much more common than is usually realized.
Fascinating. So obviously you mentioned the fact that there is actually a kind of history of philosophical thought about this inner voice, and that's very much connected to the idea of producing new knowledge or new insight, this kind of wrestle or tussle with the self. Can you talk to us a bit about how different thinkers have framed this inner conversation? How have they understood it differently in the past?
Well, I mean, to take one of the most famous examples, one of the earlier, the ancient philosopher Socrates described thinking as, and this is his own, or at least his words as recorded by Plato, talk that the soul carries on with itself. And he wrote that, or was reported to say, the soul when thinking does nothing other than discuss, asking itself questions and answering them until it reaches a conclusion not articulated to someone else, but in silence to oneself. And in one text, Socrates very jokingly describes this internal discussion. He says, this is a very near relative of mine who lives in the same house, is always waiting for me when I come home, constantly arguing with me, refuting everything, abusing and reviling me. He says, in determined pursuit of the truth. This is the famous Socratic dialogue, but held internally. And this notion that critical thinking involves inner dialogues of this kind has remained a major theme throughout Western philosophy. I mean, the political theorist Hannah Arendt, for example, describes thinking as a two-in-one dialogue. And she says, furnishing the self with itself as its own companion in solitude. I should just also say that there are many examples of people holding inner conversations with divine or diabolic figures, angels or demons, Christ or Satan. So the 15th century mystic Marjorie Kemp spoke with Christ on a daily basis for decades. The 17th century Puritan preacher and writer John Bunyan, author of Pilgrim's Progress, had a tremendous inner battle with Satan who kept telling him to sell Christ, sell Christ. And finally, Bunyan sort of gives up and accedes to this, but then is saved from damnation by the word of Christ.
So, I mean, that does lead me to ask about the quality of that inner voice, because to imagine in the Socratic notion that this produces knowledge would frame that voice as benign, but it sounds to me even he actually frames it, in fact, as potentially invasive or violent. So where the inner voice is the critic, let's say, how has that been imagined? So how have people thought about that sort of violent inner voice?
Inner voices can be extremely persecutory, very, very cruel. Now, in the past, those, I mean, Socrates is being jokey in this account, and in fact, you know, this internal discussion is incredibly important. But these voices of malediction, of cruel voices were understood mostly, of course, in religious terms. I mean, in the Western tradition. So as with Bunyan hearing Satan just demand he sell Christ, or the 18th century poet William Cowper, who was tortured by voices telling him that he's spiritually damned. Today, the poet Denise Riley has written very eloquently about inner voices that revile and curse her, which links back to a childhood in which she's constantly subjected to what she calls quite rightly hate talk. And I think it's not difficult to see how in an earlier period, these voices might have been interpreted by Riley in religious terms, while today we're much more likely to speak of them in psychological terms, in the way that, for example, the psychoanalyst Darren Leader has described as the kind of overwhelming of a child by parental speech, which then becomes part of the child's inner world, a kind of self-terrorizing internal conversation. Conversely, of course, the internalizing of loving voices from early lives can become a source of inner dialogues that nourish and sustain us when we're alone.
So just to finish off there, your project is on solitude, which of course became astonishingly pertinent, an amazing moment of coincidence with lockdown. I'm sure a lot of people are asking you to speak to them, Barbara, at the moment. Would you say that the quality of the inner voice is what makes the difference between solitude and loneliness? Does that contribute to the difference in that experience of aloneness?
I think it does. I mean, there are many different ways of approaching this, and there's not time to go into all of them. But I mean, in a sense, I mean, what I've just described, which is the difference between persecutory inner voices and those that feel really companionable to us. can make a very, very different effect on people. But there's a very important argument, which I think has a lot of interest for our time, which is that Hannah Arendt's argument that people who are able to converse, who are unable to converse freely with themselves, that interior dialogue, if that can't be a free dialogue, then that becomes a source of intense loneliness. And she, in a very famous description, she calls this a key element in totalitarianism, which through the rise of isolation, terror, and ideological propaganda made it impossible for people to engage in untrammeled inner dialogue. So they actually lost that sense of inner companionship that makes solitude livable and even tolerable. And totalitarianism, she said, breeds and feeds off extreme loneliness. And I sometimes, looking at the rise of very authoritarian or conspiracy driven forms of thought these days, I do wonder sometimes if this reflects a kind of inability, increased inability to have a kind of freely companionable inner voice, that people have had that driven back by perhaps by hate talk on social media, by just the sense of a narrowing of what kinds of inner dialogues are possible.
That's an amazing place to end, Barbara. Thank you so much. What an amazing perspective on conversation. We were going to show a short film by Dickie Bowe, and I don't know if we want to kind of experiment with that. Can I just say, first of all, though, I'm seeing that people are conversing in the chat, and actually it's kind of interesting, that digital space, that there feels like the audience can have a conversation, a secret inner conversation with itself, which is lovely. So thank you, keep adding them, and then we will draw on those when we all congregate together. So it's lovely that you're joining in the conversation. Before we talk to Dickie and maybe attempt to look at his film, I just wanted to also acknowledge the people behind the scenes who've made this project possible. And that is the Centre for Public Engagement team, and also Alicia George and Anna Bonham, who have been completely essential in actually making this work happen. Also Matthew Hilton and Philippa Lloyd, who've all really contributed to making this project possible. So thank you all so much. Dickie, will we give your film a go? What do you think? Or should we just have a chat?
Well, I mean, is it worth giving it a go?
Yeah, why not? Even if we see the silent footage, that might be weirdly appropriate. Okay, yeah, so Louisa, shall we give it, will we roll it there, Roisin, again and give it a try? And if it doesn't work, we'll give up. Right, let's see what happens.
Hello, Karen Bradley says she is profoundly sorry for her statement to the House of Commons about security force killings. She began yesterday by saying they were not crimes, and despite trying to clarify her remarks later today, she admitted her language was wrong. During that time, the number of calls for her resignation has increased, ranging from the ex-Ulster Unionist leader Mike Nesbitt to the former police ombudsman Nuala O'Lone. I spoke to Karen Bradley earlier this evening, and I began by asking her if she accepts that she's now fighting for her ministerial life.
Well, what I accept is that yesterday I said something in answer to an oral question that was wrong. I shouldn't have said it. I corrected the record as soon as I could. And I want to apologise to everybody who has been hurt or distressed by what I said. It was, as I say, it was wrong. I should not have said it.
However, you have said what you said. Are you now considering your position?
As I say, I said something in response to an oral question. As soon as I realised what I had said, I corrected the record. I did not mean to say it in that way. Or at all. I did not mean to say it. It's not what I think. It's not what I mean. So I said something wrong and I have apologised.
Yeah, and you've said that and you've made that very clear. But still, nonetheless, there are a lot of people who are very annoyed at what you said and who don't think that you're capable of doing the job in future. The former Ulster Unionist Party leader, Mike Nesbitt, said, you've consistently demonstrated you are not up to the job. How do you restore the confidence of the nationalist community in particular in Northern Ireland? A lot of people are upset and offended by what you said and think you've made a dog's breakfast of it, frankly. But the nationalist community in particular has lost confidence in you. How do you try to fix that?
As I say, I said something I shouldn't have said.
You've told me that.
And I've apologised for saying that.
Let me ask you this question. When you stood up in the House of Commons yesterday, did you intend to say that 10% of killings carried out by members of the security forces were not crimes?
No, I've said.
So that was a mistake?
I did not intend to say that. I have said what I said was wrong, and I have been quite open about that.
So the implications of what you said are very, very...
Brilliant, thank you. And
Intend to
congratulations.
say that, but said it anyway.
We can still hear them. They're kind of ghostly. Dickie, you developed this piece through your conversation with Patrick Diamond, who is in our School of Politics. And you had a conversation about Northern Ireland and Northern Irish politics. But I wonder if I could just ask you first about the fact that you are a lip sync artist and you often work with audio tracks or audio recordings that have been lost or of people who have gone. And I'm wondering, as a lip sync performer, how much does that feel like, as a performer, you're in conversation with another, even as their voice comes through your body? And I think, yeah. Sorry, that I didn't sort of give you the question at the end. How does it feel like you're in conversation with another person while you're lip syncing?
Yeah. So thanks, Aoife. Yeah, that's a good question. So, I mean, I often, although most of my shows are solo, it's just me on stage, I often think of them as being conversations. And I think that what I tend to imagine is that I'm putting the circumstances of the original text into conversation with the circumstances in which I'm playing them back. That's kind of like, that's how I think of it. And they differ depending on what the circumstances of the original text are and what the circumstances in which I'm playing them back are. So like if I do a lip sync to Kenneth Williams, then I'm putting the idea of Kenneth Williams and all of the sort of cultural baggage that's associated with him into conversation with me as, you know, as a sort of queer descendant. So conversation is central to the whole project.
So after your conversation with Patrick, you kind of reversed your practice, because what you've offered here is a voiceover of footage. And it struck me as so resonant with the fact that the Tory government banned the voices of Sinn Féin from being heard in public during the 1980s. We had this really peculiar state of affairs where we never knew what Gerry Adams sounded like. He was always voiced by an actor. So your lovely kind of subtitle, voiced by an actor, was really a beautiful kind of historical gesture. Is that what was playing out in your desire to voice Karen Bradley, who was, of course, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland? Is that what you're doing there?
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, I'd thought about, after the conversation with Patrick, and we didn't talk about that, unless I'm misremembering, we didn't talk about the fact that Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness's voices were banned by the Tories in the 80s, but it occurred to me afterwards. And so what I was originally going to do, I found a couple of good videos online of Gerry Adams talking about Margaret Thatcher banning his voice, and also the actor Stephen Ray, as Gerry Adams put it, lip syncing when he was overdubbing, but he was lip syncing to his voice. And so I was going to do a lip sync to Gerry Adams's actual voice, and then I decided to do a lip sync to Stephen Ray talking about lip syncing Gerry Adams's voice. And then finally, I was thinking about, quite a lot of people had said to me over the last few years, you should lip sync to Donald Trump, you should lip sync to Donald Trump. And I never did it because I just thought, I don't really know what I'm adding, you know, by doing that. But there is, of course, the famous comedian, famous now, Sarah, I've forgotten her name. Do you know who I mean? The comedian who's become famous she's now had a Netflix show, I think. Lip syncs to Donald Trump. Yes. Sarah Cooper, thank you, Joe Brody. The chat
is helping us.
Chat function is really coming into its own. And I was thinking, I was thinking about that. I hadn't done a lip sync to Donald Trump because I didn't think I had anything to add. I appreciate Sarah Cooper because I feel like there's something satisfying about seeing a woman ridicule Donald Trump and get one up on him somehow. But I didn't think I could bring anything additionally to the table, although I had seen some videos of Donald Trump being overdubbed. The one I found very funny, which is that he's been over in a really sort of quite fake camp voice, and the questions are all about his relationship with Putin, and he's saying sort of like, oh, but we don't have a relationship. Well, it depends what you mean by relationship, and it's really ticklish. And so I think that probably got me thinking, oh well, maybe I'll try doing something the other way around. And the last time I'd ever overdubbed anything was at the Royal Vauxhall Tavern when actually, funnily enough, we had a technical hiccup and they were playing one of my videos and the sound cut out. So I overdubbed that then. But Karen Bradley had come up in the conversation with Patrick. And so he mentioned that she'd made a real gaffe on Radio 4 during an interview. And I couldn't find that particular interview, but it turns out that she was luckily enough quite good at gaffes. So there was other material to draw on, and so then, then I decided to sort of do to a Tory what the Tories did to Sinn Féin.
Brilliant.
It's just a sketch, but it feels like the beginning of some kind of conceptual game.
Well, thank you so much, Dickie. It's such an exciting thought to think of performers as in conversation, even as they embody. And I think there's something also fascinating about the way you show up, what a voice means in the political arena. And given what's going on in Belfast at the moment, of course, that has particularly kind of an acute power at the moment. So thank you so much for the film and for taking part in the conversation. It was brilliant to have you involved. I'm going to move on now to Magda, who is reader in experimental cognitive psychology at Queen Mary, and has published on topics ranging from problem solving, motor learning, conscious and unconscious reasoning and decision making, and the cognitive basis of deception. Magda, thank you for being here. It's lovely to talk to you. And actually, before we talk, because I know you advise government, and so that actually really resonates with, actually, maybe we'll start with that because it really resonates with what Dickie's just been talking about. You advise government on a range of issues and actually around the psychology of nudging and so on. But I wonder, could you talk to us a bit about what you've observed about how conversations get brokered at government? Go on, be really libelous. We'd love you to be indiscreet, but we are recording this. So what have you noticed about the dynamics of interaction in government and what those kinds of interchanges are like?
Well, let me be a politician about this response. I advise within the civil service government. It's just because I'm nominally working as a civil servant half the time, although the civil servants never think of me as a civil servant, which is a good thing, really. So what's well, you need to be more precise here. It's like, what are your observations, basically? Dish the dirt on kind of lame conversations or absurd or rubbish or stupid conversations that might be had in the civil service stroke government. Well,
I suppose maybe I put it better. What I'm wondering about is negotiation, actually, and what the relationship might be between negotiation and conversation. How are decisions arrived at, perhaps, within that process, and what role does conversation play in that?
So this is where, I always use academia as a kind of useful counterpoint. The civil service actually fares much better.
Price.
That's not to say that there aren't kind of clashes of egos, but let's say a kind of at the level where people actually need to get on and do things, right? So there's the top level where people are just kind of perseverating and, you know, posturing. But I mean, that happens anywhere at a really senior level. You just want to look like you're doing something, you know, and assertive and kind of, you know, confident, but mostly talking nonsense. But yeah, and then at a kind of level where you actually have to implement stuff, where things are kind of consequential. What's interesting is that there's an effort to want to solve a problem that's almost impossible, which is actually, I find, hilarious. You know, you're dealing with real life kind of impossible problems. So how do you solve them in the best way you can, given the constraints you're operating under? So where I can imagine that, you know, from an academic point of view, what will happen is they think, well, I think you'll find that, yeah, and then you just get assertions of my theory, no, my theory, no, my paradigm, no, mine, and so on. And so again, yeah, you just like an impasse, you know, after a long period of time. Whereas actually that doesn't happen in at least in the fortunate instances I'm in, that, you know, you decompose the situation in some way. If anything, the reverse happens. Everyone's so terribly polite to each other that you actually don't even know whether anything has actually been solved, or, you know, who's actually kind of thinking, what are the, can you remind me what the notes were on what it was that we agreed, because everyone's agreeing with everybody. So that's one, you know, possible insight, which you don't get the same kind of styles of conversations, because one, egos don't operate in the same way in the civil service.
Fascinating. I'm interested by the idea that egos have styles, that, you know, there's different styles of communication that egos function through. And I suppose that brings me very nicely on to ask you about the work you've done with field theatre and in other contexts around brokering conversations between biomedical scientists and artists, and that's a project you've done quite recently. And I just wonder what you've observed about the nature of those conversations, when they work, when they don't, why they might not work when they do. You know, what have you seen about what makes a good conversation between people who might be coming from very different paradigms, very different forms of knowledge?
Well, the enthusiasm doesn't always go a long way. Let's start with that. You can be enthusiastic, but you can be incredibly imposing. And you think, well, you know, I could do without, you know, you telling me a whole load of stuff. So, you know, people listing a whole load of stuff without kind of being receptive to the best conversations, at least the ones that I've also tried to broker, are ones where both are kind of feeling each other out. It's just almost like a kind of therapeutic diagnostic process going on, where you think, okay, well, where's this person coming from? What's their angle? What's their edge? You know, what they motivated by? And then that, so you think, well, the thing is, it kind of does two things which are almost in contradiction. So one is kind of goal directed. I want to source some stuff out, but it's also non-goal directed, because you're completely opening the space for whatever random things, because people will say, oh, you know, odd things that sometimes might play a role. You think, oh, well, you know, I was in Japan recently. You think, well, that, or whatever it is that, you know, some, you know, people start throwing in. And so you think, well, okay, to start with, you need to somewhat kind of leave it boundless in order to find a way where then everybody kind of sorts the things and then prioritizes them. So then, in answer to your question, the worst and best is, you know, is the either side of that. So, you know, if you don't listen, no interest in actually, or you pretend, you know, you just basically listening out for keywords that will reinforce what you want. I mean, you know, it's very hard to kind of, you know, unpick that so that you can actually get people back on side, because then you'll just come across as someone slightly abrasive, you know, charming, but, you know, abrasive in some other way, because you know, it's ego driven.
I mean, that's brilliant, Magda, and a good place to end. Thank you. But what really comes to mind is a conversation I had with a physicist who talked about having done some work with an artist in CERN the Hadron Collider, and he talked really excitedly about his, his theories and his work and his maths. And she made a piece that responded to the decor of the foyer. And he felt completely crestfallen and heartbroken because she hadn't seen how much that material mattered to him. And it was very striking to me that there was a kind of gift exchange that went slightly wrong because she didn't see it was a gift. And sometimes I'm interested by the ways that sometimes there can be this misconception that academics are cerebral rather than emotional creatures, and the vulnerability that goes with academic research sometimes gets missed. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because people feel they love their work and they really care, and sometimes it doesn't get seen as that. And the same can be true for artists who are offering alternative paradigms that can't be somehow kind of processed by academics. It's really interesting. Thank you. That's brilliant. You're coming back in a minute for more conversation. Thank you so much, Magda. I just wanted to invite Elham to join us, who again is another artist who engaged in conversation. Elham is a BAFTA nominated producer, winner of the 2017 Women in Film and TV BBC Factual Award. And she talked to Megan Clinch, who's a senior lecturer in medicine and society at the Blizzard Institute. And it's so lovely to have you here, Helen. Thank you. Thank you for joining us and for taking part in that conversation. I wanted to ask you about being a producer, because the films you've made have dealt with topics as far-reaching as the disappeared in Syria, the experience of dying in the UK, the work of morticians in China. I know you're also working with our colleague Steve Eastwood in film around neurodiversity in film. Mm-hmm. And I'm imagining as a producer that a big part of your job is brokering conversations. And I'm wondering how you do that well with potentially vulnerable participants or communities who you might be documenting. What does a good conversation look like in your work?
Yeah, it's a huge question, and actually it's so interesting because every single conversation up till now I've just been nodding away and thinking, oh yes, we also do this and this. And I think the role of a producer, I mean, I should say that I'm an independent producer and I work on longitudinal documentaries over time. And so to me, one of the key elements really is time. And that's one of the biggest markers of care that you can give to an individual or a space. I think when I think about the subjects that I've engaged with, it speaks also to what drives me, the things that I'm interested in. I think knowing what's driving you is really important. It kind of echoes what Magda was talking about, this idea that you're not going into a conversation to just hear the echoes of what you already think. And storytelling over a long time and is a process of learning, and it's a process of being open. It makes me think of, being bilingual, speaking multiple languages. If you have different ways of engaging with language, then when you meet a new person, you'll first think, how do I speak to this? Which language do I use to speak to this person? I think documentary is very much that space as well. It's trying to listen first to then know how to speak, and then to develop a conversation together. I think documentaries really rely on somebody to step into the frame. I don't think you can make a film with someone at the end of their life about their death if they don't want to step into that frame. You can't work in spaces of vulnerability if somebody doesn't want to step into the frame. And perhaps that also means that there's a certain element of vulnerability that you also need to give into, which is the unknown of not knowing exactly what it is you're making. And those are the things that I've always worked with. As a producer, I think my role is often one step removed from those relationships, but it's enabling those relationships. And to do that, it's very much managing a whole host of other relationships, which are, the financial, the strategic, the creative. So managing teams, managing stakeholders, and squaring circles is often how I kind of describe my role, which in a sense is its own form of storytelling as well.
Can you just tell us how long a project might take you from beginning to end? So just some of the projects that I mentioned, what kind of time scale?
You might think that something will take a year or two, but if you're following a reality as it unfolds, you can't really know how that reality will unfold. I've worked on films that have taken 7 years to make. You mentioned the Disappeared in Syria. When we started making that film, which was Ayuni by Yasmin Feda, we weren't making a film about forcible disappearance, but our main subject disappeared. He was forcibly disappeared. And so the film, after we worked out whether that was the right thing to do, became a film about disappearance. And that was absolutely not the journey that we were intending on going on with the film. And it took 7 years.
So I'm fascinated by that sense that time is ethical, that there's an ethical investment in the longitudinal. That's very beautiful. And I wonder if you could just maybe finish by talking a little bit about how you think documentaries contribute to the public conversation, shape conversations, perhaps start them sometimes. What do you think the role of documentary film is there?
I think the role of documentary film is huge, I think, and could be much bigger. I think it has been much bigger in the past, and it's something we're losing, which to me is really disastrous as well. I think if we look at what is available, there's so much content that's available, but films that are made over time and with a different kind of care and not driven by the kind of business ethic or the kind of fast turnaround programs that seem to dominate our screens nowadays. You can see the results. It's the result in the society that we live in. It's the governments that we have. It's the things that are happening all around us. So I think there's definitely a space to understand. I don't buy in necessarily to the narrative around empathy through documentary being the only thing or the most important thing. I think it's really problematic to think that you understand someone else through having, thinking that you're kind of walking in their shoes by watching a kind of story about their lives. I think that's a kind of problematic trope that's perhaps driven us to where we are, and reality TV, which is fine, but everything has its place. But documentary is about placing a frame around reality, and the more you understand that, the more you understand that reality has no meaning, and everything is a process of storytelling and storyfying. And in our world today, it's really valuable to have a kind of an awareness of that, and to not shy away from complexity, because it's only complexity that will help us understand each other better. And hence the longitudinal, I think that's the space where you can really begin to understand, I guess.
That's absolutely amazing. Thank you so much, Elham, for joining us and for your conversation with Megan as well, which was really beautiful. I'm going to invite Lois Weaver to join us now. And actually, it feels like a really beautiful transition, because Lois, too, I think, is very invested in a very long-term way of thinking about conversation, including, of course, in the long table, Lois. So Lois is a Guggenheim-winning artist, activist, writer, director, and professor of contemporary performance at Queen Mary University of London. And her work centres on feminism, human rights, and the possibilities for public participation. And of course, we've hauled you on here, Lois, for precisely this question of participation. I'm sure lots of what Elham was saying was really resonating with you around the kind of ethics and care that conversations require. So I wonder, could you talk about one of your very long-standing art projects, which is around the development of public address systems, and what those do and what they're for?
Well, public address systems is a collection, really, of experiments that I initiated to try and create new forms, formats, protocols, architectures, maybe, for public conversation, in an attempt to, I guess, make the formal more informal, and to make the serious a bit more relaxed and easygoing, in order to bring more people into the conversation. And so I thought the best way to do that is create new formats and new structures for us to walk into, new rooms that we recognized that had been used for other purposes, but that we could come into those spaces and do something different in them and have a more public debate within those structures. And so they are long tables, as you pointed out, and they're porch sittings. They are care cafes. their situation rooms, their public studios. These are all things that we recognize on one hand, but I'm repurposing them in order to inspire a more inclusive conversation, I think.
I mean, this is where letting the artists into the university is such a brilliant move. Because I'm, you know, the sense I get, and I'm going to get you to talk about the kind of origin story of the long table. The sense I've always had from your approach is that there's a real desire to rethink the very top-down or one-way tradition in universities of the kind of the person who knows telling other people things. So could you talk to us a little bit about the long table and where it came from? Because that feels like the real origin myth of the public address systems.
Absolutely.
How did you come up with that format, and how has it been used since you invented it?
Well, it came out of my personal frustration with the panel discussion, because I've never been to a satisfying panel discussion. First of all, you know, there are 3 or 4 people down front, and there's never time for them to talk to each other and converse with each other, let alone with us. And if there is that opportunity, it's usually much more about holding forth and a lot less about actually being in dialogue. And that always terrified me and frustrated me, because I never knew how I could enter into that with my own experience and my own expertise. So I was struggling with a way to democratize that moment and to really make use of all of the expertise in the room. And maybe, you know, a lot of this is based on my own greed. I just want to know what other people are thinking and what the other experiences are and what other people might say in response to things. So an idea I had was to pull, I'd sit in a panel discussion, I'd want to pull that table into the middle of the room and circle it with everybody who wanted to come to the table. So it began a little bit like that. And then I started to think about how we have dinner table conversations and how they can become quite serious and often heated, but they are serious and playful and familiar at the same time. And I thought, what would happen if we brought the the private structure of a dinner table conversation into the public? And that's what was the origin of it, really. And then I had the opportunity back in 2003. I was in Brazil. I was working in women's prisons, and we wanted to create an event where we, you know, in this crazy way, brought together some of the women from the prison, the governors from the prison, the ministers of justice from the government, the artists who were working in the prison. What would happen if we could all sit them down at the same table? Just what kinds of conversations would happen? And luckily, Paul Heritage said, let's go for it. And we trialed the long table, and it worked. Oddly enough, it worked. And I kept refining it and kept doing it. And now other people are doing it. And to answer the last bit of your question, we've done long tables on technology and democracy, done technologies on how to make the archive more inclusive and diverse, on how to confront and embrace fragile masculinity, sex and aging, how to, you know, bring the local community into the fortress of the university. I mean, it's always a long table on, and you can fill in that blank, basically.
Yeah, fantastic. I was going to ask you how conversation can be seen as a feminist practice, and in some ways you've kind of answered that. I don't know if you want to answer it anyway, but there's a question has occurred to me while you're talking, Lois, and so you're going to hate me because I didn't send it to you in advance.
I'm not prepared.
But knowing you as I do, I'm wondering how you've started to experiment with this space and thinking about this kind of room and what kinds of formats might be possible in the digital realm. I mean, it's occurring to me that chat is, you know, we actually have all the people in the room chatting actually while we're talking, which is in some ways doing what you were saying of the long table. So have you been experimenting with the digital space as a format?
I have been, in the sense that I've brought not the long table necessarily, but the Care Cafe and the Porch Sitting onto the digital space. And I suppose my overall intention when I've done both of those is to try to soften the edges of the frame, to love the frame, to use the frame, but to somehow soften the edges of the frame in the ways that we communicate. And part of what softens that is to come without an agenda, because that's what what's all of these don't have a particular agenda attached to it. So there's nothing to accomplish. So bringing people into this space to just chat with each other, and the porch sitting works really well, because this goes back to what you were talking about with Pat. On a porch, you sit facing in the same direction, and you just talk about what you're wondering, what might be coming up the road, what might be happening in the back, in the kitchen. And then on Zoom, we're doing exactly that. We're all facing in the same direction. And so if we can get ourselves into the spirit of wonder and in the spirit of the breath. So I'm trying to breathe some life into this. And I'm actually quite in love with Zoom at the moment for those reasons. And I guess like with the other formats that are in the live space, to use it, not ignore it, not to pretend like it's not true. What do we have? We have frames, we have breakout rooms. So in the Care Cafe, for instance, the breakout rooms are our cafe tables. So to rename the architecture of Zoom in a way that might encourage us to be a little bit more friendly with it. Yeah, I'm quite enjoying it, actually.
That's brilliant. Thank you, Lois. And what you're saying actually does really call us all to have a conversation in a moment. And to think and to wonder, because we don't really have an agenda for this event. It's actually really nice, this panel. We're just chatting about chatting, which is marvelous. I'm going to bring in our last speaker in one moment, Chloe Osborne, but I just want to give a final thank you before I do to the person who's really been most instrumental in making this project possible, and that's Molly McPhee, who is the creative producer, who many of you will have been hearing from in the past few weeks. Talking of care, her emails are works of art. They're so careful and thoughtful and sensitive and supportive. And she has worked really tirelessly, to the point where I've been slightly alarmed sometimes at how hard she's worked to make these conversations possible and to help organizing the events as well. So Molly, you're amazing. Thank you. Certainly saved my bacon many times. And again, I suppose it's acknowledging how much work it takes to make conversations happen and how many other people can be involved in allowing two people to speak and helping them do that well. So thank you, Molly. I just want to finish by introducing Chloe, who is another artist who took part in our conversations. Chloe, thank you so much for being with us. Chloe is an artist, agitator, and creative producer who creates participatory and interventionist art projects which seek to reinforce social bonds. And I know you've just launched a project, actually just this weekend, so congratulations, involving the phrasing of this is amazing, 81 acts of exuberant defiance to mark the 40th anniversary of the Brixton riots. So I know that this project has been a kind of conversation with the past, but it must also have involved loads of conversations with residents in Brixton, community organizations, activists. Tell us a bit about what form those conversations have taken and what it's taken to make them happen.
Thanks very much. I think it's really interesting, even starting with it launched on the weekend. We got money, that's what happened. It's been going on since 2017.
Yeah.
Like actually the whole thing came out of a conversation about the 35th anniversary. And my collaborator, who kind of him and I catalyzed the 81 with a conversation, had been in this conversation that marked the 35th anniversary. And it was people with lived experience of the uprising gathering at the Black Cultural Archives to remember and connect. And we had a conversation later in that year that was, what if that conversation wasn't in a closed room? What if that conversation was on the streets of Brixton? What if that conversation was between the people with lived experience and the young people coming up in school who didn't know what the uprisings or the Brixton riots were yet? What if that conversation was between new residents living in their penthouse suites above the new Brixton market, looking over Railton Road and seeing the cocktail bars and having no idea it was the front line? So how could we take that conversation out and permeate it into both the fabric of Brixton as a place, but also between difference? So that it wasn't the conversation coming out of shared experience, but it was a conversation that was coming out of the widest breadth of difference that we could possibly imagine. And so it began a whole set of conversations that were, what might it be? What would it take? And the whole thing of 81 Acts of Exuberant Defiance is really an experiment in conversation between the past and the present, but also between the present and the future. how does this anniversary allow us to connect in new ways, to imagine how the community might develop new strategies of resistance and resilience by coming together in that raised awareness and understanding. And it's ongoing. So there are conversations that have happened with ideas feasts. I love the long table work that Lois does. And we held spaces where they weren't facilitated. People just kind of arrived in a space around Brixton, and there were invitations and provocations and questions across tables and cups and plates and walls, and people were in it. And they responded and talked and connected and added. And we came back at the end and documented it, and then tried to forge something that would allow all of those ideas space to breathe and evolve. And that was right at the beginning. Like at this moment in time, we are moving into kind of different kinds of experiments. So we've been talking with People Speak about talkioki, which is a glorious invention with a round table that travels through streets, and it has a facilitator who's trained up in the middle of it, and people talk around the edge of it. So we've been talking about doing a project with them where Brixton community members are skilled up to have their own talkioki cable that moves around. We've been talking, we're going to do a mile in their shoes with the Empathy Museum, which is where people walk a mile in other people's shoes while listening to their stories. And we're going to get people to walk the front line whilst listening to stories of people who were in the uprisings in Brixton, in Toxteth, in Handsworth, in St. Paul's, in Chapeltown, in Moss Side, so that it's also a conversation between places. Because the thing that always happens is that it's compartmentalized and suppressed. Even the idea that it's still Brixton riots and it's not part of the UK civil rights movement. The idea that people in Brixton, if they do know about it, they only know what happened in Brixton. So like, how do we start having these conversations between places and between all the people of those places, so that you can't not know. It's impossible to be in those places and not know anymore. And that's really the biggest part of the conversation that we're having, is between the place and the people in the place.
Brilliant. Chloe, that is, I mean, it's so exciting. And it so chimes with Lois's work around conversational formats. And I know you had a conversation with Jen Harvey in drama around the, you know, gentrification, the infrastructure of the city, the question of the streets, which is really exciting. I'm going to ask you a question, which brings us very nicely back to the conversation I was having with Pat right at the start, just to finish up, which is the fact that you've been using gaming as a technique to help promote conversation. Can you just talk to us for a minute about that, and then we'll open up to wider conversation between us all?
Sure. It's like the gaming becomes an intermediary, or like the catalyst of conversation. So when you're talking about people in place, it allows you to have a conversation with a place without another person being present. So that idea of this allows the game, as I've been working with kind of mobile devices, how can the mobile device create a game that you play with the place that you think you know? And how can that game teach you that you don't know anything about it? Or that things that you know are one layer of a very, very deep onion, and that you may never get to that middle, but at least 3 or 4 layers. Come on, people, the top layer is just lazy, right? And so the games are really kind of a way of starting to take those top layers off. And it's kind of like a duty, I think, actually. I'm creating something called a ritual of grounding at the moment. And it's that idea of like, it's your responsibility if you move into a place to actually peel at least 3 layers off in your first month. So the idea that you kind of arrive in a place and may take 5, 6 years to start knowing some really key basic things about that place is lazy. And I think that we need to take that on board as human beings.
Brilliant. What a great way to end, Chloe. Thank you so much. I think you and Pat need to have a chat, actually. Pat, I'm looking at you, Pat, in your tiny square, because I suspect you'd have lots of interests in common. I wonder, could I ask all the speakers to join me now? I mean, again, I'm sort of saying that roll it there, Roisin. I don't know if it's possible for us all to be on the screen together, but it would be lovely if we could all now turn to conversation together, and to hear perhaps what we think the through lines might be of the conversation. What do we think the commonalities or questions might be that we share in common around these issues, around how conversations work, what's at stake in them, how they go right or wrong, what it takes to make them work? I'm going to ask you to take over for me slightly, because I'd like to look at the chat and just see if I can capture some of the audience's comments. So over to you all now. You all have to have awkward silence while you try and work out who's going to speak next. Pat can decide who takes turns. Any thoughts on commonalities of concerns or through lines? Chloe?
I was just going to say something about time.
So was I.
Great. I was just going to reflect on the idea that often conversations take the form of something that's really time bound, like that conversation that you had in that moment in that time, rather than this kind of long, evolving, unpredictable conversation that may happen over years or decades. And I think that there's something in that practice of conversation and how we re-educate ourselves around valuing them. The long, careful, compassionate conversations that evolve, that change us. And actually there's something really different than that from the fast conversations that move you to the next place.
And I was going to say that exactly about time. And I loved what Elman said about time as what did you say? A time as a maker of care. I just think that's beautiful. And absolutely a lot of the work that I've made, particularly the porch sitting, came out as a research technique I was using to just go and sit with people long enough until the subject came out that we wanted to talk about research and move forward on. But just that idea of what it means to wait. And you mentioned, Aoife, the awkward silence. In each of the formats that I talk about is let there be some public silence, because there's listening in that. There's listening to our inner voices, as Barbara was talking about, but there's also listening and enabling other voices to come forward when we don't just keep talking. Mm-hmm. So time that was a beautiful thing to say about time.
Barbara.
I was just thinking that, a theme that's kind of been moving through, I think some of these has been the relationship between freedom and conversation, because I think one of the things that it's the silencing of people has played a major part in both the past and present day operations of power. And of course, feminists have often had a lot to say about the silencing of women in different contexts. But it seems to me that this is a moment when questions about, in a way, the right to converse, the right to speak freely with others, not simply in the sense of not necessarily being subjected to the kind of silencing of authoritarian regimes or whatever, but also maybe kind of returning to Hannah Arendt, the ways that certain forms of authoritarianism can actually force upon people a kind of internal prohibitions on even allowing themselves to have a kind of inner conversation. So I'd be very interested to know what other participants, people have talked about such a wide range of forms of conversation, think about this question about the relationship between freedom and conversation. So,
if I could speak, yeah. It's interesting, I was thinking something quite similar and thinking about dominant narratives versus kind of the quieter narratives, and thinking that one of the commonalities, I've taken so many notes during these conversations, was very much about the question of space and creating space, but also safe space. And also I just wanted to make a note, because I use this analogy of walking in one's shoes, and then Chloe talks about this amazing project, which is walking in someone's shoes. But I suppose it comes back to this idea of space. And, what I'm talking about is this lazy narrative of like the surface level stereotype being enough to understand something, versus a project that is actually making you move, like make your body move, make you feel with all of your senses. And I think that's also a question of space and feeling kind of held and cared for enough or safe enough to express, to experience, and to listen. And I think this idea of freedom also speaks to institutions and how, you know, the conversations we have. So for example, the emails that we constantly kind of send back and forth have become so much more administrative. They're not conversational anymore, whereas the beginning of that medium was medium to kind of communicate, for example, like off the top of my head. And I think, you know, these spaces all become spaces where we can rethink conversation because they're creating active space.
I'm interested by Pat pointing to how important space is in terms of us getting all of the information in a conversation, not only. It's interesting how technology assumes that it's our faces that matter, and that's, you know, that's where the communication sits. But of course, what you're describing in terms of space, we might not even be looking at somebody's face. We may, as with Lois's porch sittings, be looking out on the porch somewhere in the southern states of America. Maybe not, Lois. But yes, that sense that the space will organize the quality of the conversation. And as you say, Elham, also allow us to inhabit it with others over long periods of time sometimes.
I still can't get my mind off the time. And someone in the chat said, is it a maker of time or a marker of time? And I think, actually, I said maker, but I think you said marker, but I think it's both. But I was thinking about, you know, freedom of speech is such a contentious thing, and particularly in this country at this moment. And I was thinking and this just happened on my porch just yesterday. Somebody is not getting the vaccination, somebody's getting the vaccination. And before there could be a conversation, they left the porch. So it's like we don't spend enough time at the table to sort of get past that. I don't agree with you, you don't agree with me, I'm out. And again, I just think, you know, in terms of freedom to express, we need the time to listen, and we need to take the time to listen and not to jump and leave or cancel. And that's anyway, so I think time is infiltrating all of my thinking at the moment.
Can I add one? I mean, this is potentially helpful, but I will say, yeah, much of what we're talking about is kind of oriented around the function of, well, I'm going to put this in my own terms, which are probably not going to bear any reality to what you think. The function of conversation to reach some point of value, right? Some insight, something where you just think, okay, you've kind of committed to paying attention, to listening to someone else, to gaining something more than you would have got to start with. But then, of course, yeah, the vast majority, I suspect Pat can, you know, give some percentages here, is not that. Yeah, it's not that. It doesn't have to be that. Right? Sometimes, yeah, you just want to say to someone, someone's going to go there back. You think, yeah, it's completely trivial, but you think it serves a kind of emotional, I don't know, salve of some kind, right? So you just think, well, we don't always have to have like these 7-year-long, you know, conversations with kind of mighty epiphanies. Yeah, because the thing is that, yeah, the diversity of the range of functions of conversation is enormous. You think, well, you know, and similarly, what people get in terms of value out of the conversations, right? So that, yeah, this will be maybe hugely valuable or not at all to other people other than just us. Right? So it's just like, yeah, there's all of these other dimensions which matter. Yeah, I suppose one final thing then is to kind of say, well, yeah, where the silencing matters. Yeah, I think that it's kind of an interesting point. Where, you know, where is it? Are we silencing at all manner of levels, or is it just at a particular level? Right, so you think, well, yeah, we were worried about freedom of speech. Is it that we're also, there's a limit to, well, as Barbara's saying, internally, what we can actually, you know, a potential dialogue, but also, to others, even at the kind of blur level, right? So that I don't know, and I'd be terrified if it even reaches at that level, because then that's kind of putting a limit on all manner of things, which it shouldn't, at least to my mind, be encroaching on.
Pat, did you want to jump in there?
Yeah, well, there's a thing that happens, especially, I mean, you made this point about video, which is that it's too easy to think about conversation as speaking, and having a channel to speak into, and to think about freedom as being the opportunity to speak, because it obscures the listener. So it's the points that Lois was just making, really, that listening isn't just being an ear. It's a really active thing, right? You move your face, and you have to give appropriately timed signals that you are, you know what's going on, and you're actively engaging with it. And I like to think of conversation basically as routine misunderstanding, right? I think by default we misunderstand each other, and we have to work hard to overcome that. And as Magda said, sometimes we don't care that much, right? There are some situations in which we know something might not have been understood, or it might be going wrong, but we just don't try that hard. But when we're really engaging, we have to give back paraphrases to each other. We have to sort of signal the words that we didn't quite catch, or the views that we didn't quite follow, and do the work of trying to build shared understanding. And every conversation requires some of that, I think.
It makes me think of my favorite playwright, Samuel Beckett, which never sounds like it's going to be a cheerful thing to say, but Beckett actually, for me, is one of the kindest playwrights, because always his characters, who often have these kind of streams of language, there's always a silent figure or a quiet figure who listens, and actually their relationship is often one of deep compassion. And there's something about that listening and talking that's incredibly beautiful, and very funny a lot of the time, because of the misunderstandings and those missed moments. And he's a playwright who's known for his pauses. So, and his silences. Pat, sorry, I interrupted you there. Go on.
It's, well, inevitably.
Yes, exactly.
No, absolutely. I think Beckett's a really interesting case, and he always makes this point that he doesn't know what he's saying. My own words were to me as the buzzing of an insect. And because you don't know what you're saying. You don't know what the words you've said mean until you've engaged with someone and they've responded to you. You're not like Humpty Dumpty. You don't get to determine how English works, right? It's a shared. It's like a currency, right? You don't determine the value of a pound because it's a contract between loads of people. You don't determine the value of a word either, because that's a contract in a community with a load of people that you have to interact with to work out, in order to know what you're actually saying.
And that's so interesting. So it resonates so much with what Elham was talking about being bilingual, of knowing that words actually have different registers and have these different kinds of weight in different languages, probably shapes actually how you use one of those languages, I imagine. And I'm wondering how power comes into play, which feels like it's been there all along and everybody's talked about, but we actually haven't used the word, where what we're partly talking about is transactions of power and status. And some of the conversations we've talked about is where there might be an imbalance of power between the conversationalists, or different kinds of power and how we navigate those. I'm wondering if anyone wants to commandeer that word or think about what it means for them. I mean, it strikes me, Lois, that one of your projects has really been to try and manage that, and Chloe, actually, it sounds to me like you're both really thinking about how you navigate that formally by creating methodologies that sort of navigate power carefully. Would I be right in saying that, or am I projecting wildly?
Well, I think with long tables, certainly it's a question of decentralizing the power. So there's no moderator, there's no one person who's going to lead the agenda, that the power is disseminated and shared by whoever's willing to come to the table. So I think that it, you know, when I talked about the panel and my frustrations with the panel, it's my frustration with the power of knowledge with a capital K, and the institutional knowledge, and the way that loads of people are left out of that, and the lived experience is disempowered in that moment. So I guess it's about empowering the lived experience and the participants in any given situation, and that's what the structures try to do.
I've noticed Maria Turi's comment in the chat, which I think is really interesting, that there's a relationship between care and fear in conversations, and that does speak, I think, to the question of power. And she's suggesting that maybe some of the fast and furious conversations are dominated by fear rather than confidence or levity, like you're talking about, Magda. Yeah, so there's something fascinating there, that fear might actually be governing some of those more formal conversational formats, because they try and eradicate uncertainty, don't they? They try and eradicate things getting out of hand. Actually, they try and eradicate conversation to some degree, because people can know that they have a format that's controlled, and conversation is actually reasonably limited. Whereas the formats you're talking about, the ones that Chloe's talking about, are ones where really things can get said that no one's predicted. That strikes me as some people might feel quite fearful about that. Did you want to come in there on that, Chloe? Have people been saying things that are unexpected? I imagine so.
Yes, and always, and rightly so. And I think that part of this process has been to acknowledge that there needs to be many different kinds of conversations in many different places, in many different modes. And that the experiment is to find a way that people can find a way of connecting to one of them, as it were. So it's not that this is the thing that we're going to do and that everybody will come here. It's that people are coming up with ideas for their tenants association to be in conversation. It's that residents of the Railton Road are coming up with ideas for them to be in conversation with that place. People with lived experience of the uprising are coming up with conversations about their experience filtering outwards. Everybody's having conversations about conversations. And so they're manifesting in multiple different ways in parallel. And that means that there are different points of access. And there are ways in which one of those might be absolutely terrifying. I mean, I'm terrified of live improvisation. We're doing some work with Improbable and Wild Works, and I'm terrified of that. But for some people, that is the place of joy and openness like no other. So yeah, it's about finding the one in which you have an access point, and it may push you outside of your comfort zone, but you need to be able to step in.
I think that's a really beautiful place to end. And I just noted that Andrew Walker, who actually designed the website for this project, has put in the chat, I enjoy random, spontaneous conversations with complete strangers. Not had many of those during the last 12 months. So I absolutely agree with you, Andy. And what I would love to think is that whenever it's possible, we might restage this conversation in a room and manage to get everybody, you know, the audience who are all there sort of faceless for us, but we know you're here and we feel watched, just like a Beckett character, these faces in the dark. You know, we might actually get into a room and see each other. Wouldn't that be brilliant? But I can only just say thank you all so much. That was such an interesting and rich conversation. The commonalities between you all were really, really striking. And also the distinctions, the ways in which you've all come at this question from such a range of perspectives. Thank you again to all of you who've been involved with this project. Celebrating conversation this year feels like the right thing to have done. So I'm going to, we'll have one of Lois's awkward silences as we all go off Zoom, which it's a bit like when you say goodbye to people and then you end up walking in the same direction down the street. I always think that with finishing Zoom conversations. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to our speakers. Rounds of applause to everybody